There is something that tour guides rarely mention when you visit a medieval castle. We traveled to the ruins of Château Gaillard, built by Richard the Wayne of England on the banks of the Seine River in Normandy in the late 12th century. From a distance, the fortress still commands respect. The concentric walls, the keep rising above the cliff, the dry moat separating the three tiers of defense. From up here, we understand why Richard, known as the Lionheart, called this place his fair daughter. It was, by the standards of the time, a masterpiece of military engineering. But the closer we get, the more we walk through the stone corridors that still remain, a question begins to surface. And it is a question no medieval architect would want you to ask. Where, exactly, did the 400 soldiers who lived here go to the bathroom? The answer, we discovered, is literally built into the walls, and it reveals more about medieval life, about engineering, about military strategy, and about human nature than any history textbook could imagine. To understand what we call the garderobe, the medieval word for what was essentially a latrine, we first need to understand the problem it was trying to solve. A functioning medieval castle was not merely a lordly residence. It was a city compressed within stone walls. At Windsor Castle, for example, records from the 13th century indicate that the complex housed, in times of crisis, between 300 and 500 people. Soldiers, servants, craftsmen, clergy, animals. All of these people ate, and everything that goes in must inevitably come out. The earliest medieval solutions to this problem were brutally simple. Holes dug into the floors of inner courtyards, buckets emptied out of windows, communal cesspits in the basements. But these solutions created serious problems. The accumulation of waste inside the walls was a devastating vector for disease. Outbreaks of dysentery could kill more soldiers than any enemy army. There are records from the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade in 1191, in which gastrointestinal illness wiped out entire contingents of crusaders before they had even made direct contact with Saladin's forces. Medieval engineering, therefore, needed a solution. And it found one that was, at the same time, brilliant and absolutely repugnant. The classic garderobe is a tiny chamber, almost always built as a niche within the thickness of the stone walls. The walls of a castle like Château Gaillard reach up to 4 meters thick at certain points, more than enough space to carve out a private chamber. Inside this chamber, a stone slab with a hole. Below the hole, a vertical shaft, a bottomless pit that descended along the exterior wall of the castle for dozens of meters, ending at some conveniently distant point. The moat, the river, the cliff. There was no collection. There was no regular cleaning. Gravity did the work. By medieval standards, this was considerable sanitary sophistication. At Château Gaillard, we found evidence of at least 23 garderobes distributed across the different sectors of the fortress. The keep had private access for the lord and his immediate family. The outer walls had simpler niches for the troops. There was, in terms of access to sanitation, a hierarchy just as rigid as the social hierarchy. The feudal lord relieved himself in relative comfort and privacy. The common soldier used a slit in the wall with the wind blowing from every direction. The word garderobe itself is revealing. In Old French, it literally means to keep clothes. Medieval people discovered, for reasons any modern chemist could explain, that the ammonia odor from human waste repelled moths and preserved the fibers of woolen and linen garments. It was not uncommon, therefore, for the garderobe to function simultaneously as a bathroom and a wardrobe. Clothes hung over the shaft, absorbing the vapors. The moths died. The clothes were preserved. It is difficult, from the vantage point of the 21st century, to contemplate this reality without a certain discomfort. But it is important to resist the impulse to judge. Medieval people were not dirty for lack of intelligence or civility. They were dirty for lack of infrastructure, an infrastructure that the fall of the Roman Empire had taken with it and that Europe would take centuries to rebuild. If you are finding this story fascinating, it helps enormously to hit the like button below. That is how the channel reaches more curious people like you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and ring the bell, because there is much more history like this on the way. Here we arrive at one of the most fascinating and least documented aspects of life in medieval castles: the smell. Smell is, by definition, something that history cannot preserve. There are no olfactory records, but we can reconstruct, from indirect sources, what it was like to live inside a medieval fortress in full operation. Accounts from foreign visitors who arrived at European courts of the period describe repeatedly the odor as one of the first and most striking impressions. An ambassador from the Abbasid Caliphate who visited the court of the Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century left records in which he described the smell of the Frankish nobility as unbearable to the trained nose of a civilized man. It is an observation loaded with cultural bias, of course, but it is also a historical data point. The shafts of the garderobes over time accumulated considerable deposits on their inner walls. In castles that functioned for decades or centuries, these deposits could reach thicknesses of 20-30 centimeters of calcified organic material. Archaeologists who worked on the ruins of Bodiam Castle in East Sussex found layers of material in the shafts that allowed them, through stratigraphic analysis, to date different periods of occupation of the fortress. It is archaeology of the bowels, literally, and it tells stories that the medieval chronicles elegantly omitted. The moat that surrounded a functioning castle was not, to the modern imagination, that tranquil, reflective mirror of water we see in children's book illustrations. It was, frequently, a repository for everything the castle's inhabitants needed to discard: human and animal waste, food scraps, refuse of every kind. In castles built over rivers or streams, the current helped disperse the waste. But in fortresses with dry moats or standing water, accumulation was inevitable. This reality had a tactical consequence that medieval military engineers quickly recognized. The smell was a defense. A besieging army attempting to approach the walls had to cross that moat. Under normal conditions, this was already difficult enough. Moats could be 10, 15, 20 meters wide, and the walls above were manned by archers. But the olfactory factor added a layer of psychological adversity that medieval military chronicles rarely discussed openly, but that was always present. Camping near a besieged castle was, from a sanitary standpoint, an experience of extreme degradation. The besieging army, deprived of adequate shelter and living in the open near a saturated moat, frequently succumbed to the same diseases that worried the defenders. It was involuntary bacteriological warfare, waged by both sides simultaneously. But here, at this precise point in our story, we arrive at the central irony that makes the subject of medieval garderobes so extraordinarily fascinating. The very same shaft that expelled waste away from the walls created, structurally, a vulnerability. A garderobe shaft was a hole that passed through the castle wall from the inside out. It was, in principle, a way in. We found the most dramatic evidence of this vulnerability on a single night in February of 1204. Here at Château Gaillard. The context: Richard the Lionheart had died 5 years earlier in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in the Limousin. His successor, his brother John I, the same John who some years later would sign Magna Carta under duress from his own barons, had inherited an Angevin empire that was beginning to unravel. Philip II of France, patient and methodical, had waited for the right moment. And in 1203, he began the siege of Château Gaillard, the jewel of the English military crown in Normandy. The siege lasted months. The fortress held. The defenders' provisions dwindled, but the walls remained intact. Philip tried scaling, tried undermining the foundations, tried a total blockade. Nothing worked. Then, a French soldier. His name did not survive in the chronicles, which is, in itself, a historical injustice, made an observation. There was a chapel window in the second enclosure of the castle, and beneath that window, running down the stone wall, was a garderobe shaft. The shaft ended at a section of the wall that, on the inside, gave access to the second enclosure. The second enclosure was separated from the third, where the keep stood, by another wall. But entering the second enclosure meant already being inside the outer defenses. The historical records, primarily the account of Guillaume le Breton, chronicler of Philip II's court, describe what happened next with a precision that blends the epic and the scatological in a way no modern screenwriter would dare invent. A small group of French soldiers in the dead of night descended into the moat and climbed the garderobe shaft. Literally. They climbed up through the shaft, through the accumulated waste, through the darkness and the odor that must have made the experience close to unbearable, and emerged inside the walls of Château Gaillard's second enclosure. The group was small. Some sources say 3 men, others speak of as many as 10. But it was enough to create the necessary chaos. The soldiers found the chapel entrance, made enough noise to rouse the garrison, and in the panic that followed, lowered the drawbridge for the French contingent waiting outside. The second enclosure fell that night. From that point, the fall of the castle was merely a matter of time and conventional engineering. In March of 1204, Château Gaillard, Richard's fair daughter, the fortress that had cost the equivalent of 2 years of the entire English crown's revenue, was in French hands. With it, Normandy. With Normandy, the heart of the Angevin Empire on the continent. One of the greatest territorial transfers of power in the Middle Ages was precipitated, at least in part, by a hole in the wall where people went to the bathroom. Now I need to know, have you ever visited a medieval castle? And did you know you were standing on top of a story like this? Tell us in the comments where you are watching this from. I love knowing where this curious crowd comes from. Château Gaillard was not the only case. Researching medieval military records, we found similar patterns in other sieges. Montségur Castle, the Cathar stronghold in the French Pyrenees, fell in 1244 after a 10-month siege. Although the circumstances are more complex, there was also negotiation and internal betrayal. Records indicate that a group of climbers gained initial access to the complex through a fissure in the rock near a waste discharge point. Military engineers of the period clearly knew about this vulnerability. The military architecture manuals that survived from the 13th and 14th centuries mention, with increasing frequency, the need to defend garderobe shafts with iron grates, downward-facing spikes, or by constructing curved shafts, technically more difficult to build but impossible to climb. Caerphilly Castle in Wales, built in the late 13th century by Gilbert de Clare, displays some of the most sophisticated solutions to this problem. The garderobe shafts at Caerphilly are constructed at an oblique angle, deviating at least twice before reaching the exterior of the walls. From a sanitary standpoint, this created obvious complications for cleaning and maintenance. From a security standpoint, it made internal climbing virtually impossible. It is a solution that says much about what medieval military architects had learned from their predecessors' mistakes. There is also, in this world of stone and excrement and military strategy, a more intimate dimension worth exploring. The garderobes reserved for the lord's family were, comparatively, spaces of relative comfort. In palaces like Westminster, medieval administrative documents record the existence of royal garderobes with polished wooden seats, a considerable luxury. Fabric was available for personal hygiene, frequently dried moss or coarse wool. In wealthier contexts, documents describe the use of linen cloth. The English expression, going to the privy, derives directly from this architecture. The garderobe was, literally, a private space in an environment where privacy was a class privilege. For soldiers and servants, the experience was radically different. The communal garderobes on the outer walls were frequently without partitions, the medieval equivalent of a public restroom with no stalls. There were, in the administrative records of large castles, regular payments to figures called rakers or Gong Farmers. Workers specializing in the cleaning and maintenance of the shafts and the material accumulated in the moats. It was the worst paid and most socially despised work in the entire medieval hierarchy, but it was also absolutely indispensable work. Without them, the shafts would clog, the moats would overflow, and the diseases that medieval architects so feared would render the castles uninhabitable. What you are about to hear is one of those stories that official history prefers to forget. If you have a friend who thinks history is boring, send them this video, because there is nothing boring about this. There is a Gong farmer mentioned in the records of Windsor Castle from 1246, identified only as Thomas. Thomas received 2 pennies a day for his work, exactly half what an ordinary soldier received. We know nothing more about Thomas. We do not know what his life was like outside his working hours, what he thought, whether he had a family, but we know that without Thomas and hundreds like him, the great castles of medieval Europe would not have functioned. History, as always, remembers the kings and forgets the workers who made the kings' lives possible. When we look today at the castles that survived, Château Gaillard, Windsor, Caerphilly, Bodiam, Carcassonne, We tend to see them as monuments to grandeur, to power, to permanence. And they are, undeniably, all of that. But they are also monuments to a daily life that was, for the most part, uncomfortable, foul-smelling, physically hard, and psychologically cramped. The garderobe is, in that sense, the most effective antidote to medieval romanticism. It is impossible to look at that niche carved into the wall with its hole over the abyss and continue fantasizing about chivalric glory without some degree of recalibration. What the history of medieval garderobes teaches us, in the end, is not merely about sanitation or architecture or military strategy. It is about the permanence of the most basic human needs in the face of any cultural or political construction. Kings and peasants, knights and archers, all needed the same niche in the wall. The difference lay only in the quality of the seat and the extent of the privacy. The shaft descended, in every case, to the same moat. And it is here that we return at last to where we began. We are back before Château Gaillard at dusk, with the Seine reflecting a copper-colored sky below. The walls are silent. The tourists have gone. The soldiers left 800 years ago. The smell, mercifully, did not survive. But the shafts are still there, carved into the stone, mute witnesses to a life that was, at the same time, more brutal and more sophisticated than we generally admit. Witnesses to a night in February of 1204, when a nameless group of soldiers changed the map of Europe by climbing somewhere that better men than them, kings, generals, architects, had never thought to look. The future of studies in medieval military architecture passes increasingly through exactly these overlooked details. Archaeologists at Cardiff University are today developing environmental DNA analysis techniques that allow them to extract information from the organic deposits preserved in medieval garderobe shafts. Data about the inhabitants' diet, about the diseases that afflicted them, about the microbial life of environments that vanished centuries ago. It is an archaeology that begins with what the inhabitants wanted to hide and ends by revealing what no chronicle dared to record. The castle as a monument to power, the garderobe shaft as an archive of real life. History, as always, lives in the details no one wanted to tell.